So this is the last part, and if you think back to the kind of adaptive management cycle, that management actions or management recommendations, part of it was really key. And we have a number of projects that are not only in this section, kind of where they're addressing management questions, they may be seen in other sections as well. So, for example, earlier, whoops. To figure out which screen I have the changes going on. There we go. Okay. For example, earlier we talked about the invasive species experiments, which we took that approach early on in our, in our work because we had some questions that we really needed answered in that experimental approach. And now we're moving into more of a management action plus monitoring sort of cycle where we're implementing the things that we found out during the experiments, and we're continuously monitoring throughout. I'm going to go into that just a little bit, but I do want to say that these are some of our other projects that are also somewhere in the management action slash experimental approach section, and those would be arthropods, bats, wildlife cameras, and tortoises. You'll be hearing more about those in the upcoming year because they're very visible projects. Keep an eye out for our lunch and learns and things like that. I'm not going to go into great detail here, but our invasive species is just a really good example of that. I'm going to have John Loylett from the city of Scottsdale and Paul Staker take it from here, and they are going to explain how we went from finding the results of our experiment that Mary shared with us just a little bit ago to what we are doing now and the expanded approach that we are taking with the city of Scottsdale and what kind of an impact that's having. So from there, John and Paul, take it away and just let me know when you want me to flip the slide.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am John Loylett, and many of you know that I am at the Pima Dynamite Trailhead. And I've, as a representative of the city of management, I guess that's kind of an interesting spot for me to be in. I can tell you that, and many of you know, the city has been committed to this project literally since day one. When we started to put our heads together and figure out will have a problem with invasive species, we were ready to go and see what it was going to take to get that thing, to get it taken care of, to manage it, all of that stuff. It is nice to know that the commitment that we have, the city has, is not just at the preserve staff level, but it goes all the way up into management in the city. And part of our management directive is to keep and preserve biodiversity in the preserve. So we are totally committed with this project and many of the other projects that are going on out there. And so, in other words, you can count on the city still being there. So we look at this as a very long-term project. We have put in, as you well know, we work together to put in money for grants that, especially the DFFM grant that we recently received. We've got that money. We will use general funds and potentially the money from the preserve tax to keep these projects going and stay on top of the invasives. So we're going to stay with it, and we're long-term on this project. With the DFFM grant, it seemed that because we had a lot of our ducks in a row because of all the tremendous amount of work that the Conservancy and the stewards have done, mapping and finding out where all these invasives are, Willie was quite impressed at how organized, how directed, and how committed we were to this project. And so many times it seems that other areas will see a problem. They might have a couple of years of money to work with, and let's see what we can do for just a couple of years. We look at it as we're going on with this thing as long as it takes. So I think that impressed Willie, and he liked the fact that we were going to be around long term. So we're going to be there. That grant was $192,000, I believe, something like that. And we had to put a 25% match in on that, which was not hard at all, because many of the stewards, Paul's crew, were out there. Their hours dedicated to this will easily match that percentage that we've got to do. So our priorities are, the city's priorities with the invasives is, I think there's about 10 invasives that are on the list. You know which ones we are going after, and the others that are out there that we happen to come across, they're in trouble too. But we tend to focus a lot on buffle, stinknet, and the fountain grass. But there's a number of them out there that we are going to engage should we come across them. What I do is, this is tied in just ever so slightly with fire, and especially in the north area, I will spray along the APS and WAPA power lines. Some of the trails that are wide enough to take the spray truck, I am spraying those shoulders to increase our fire break. If there happens to be invasives in those shoulders that my spray hits, that's good for us. So we're trying to reduce fire as well as take care of some of those invasives that tend to be a fire hazard to us as well. So I work very closely with Paul and the other sprayers that are out there, arranging chemicals that they need, some of the training that we all have to go through every year and stuff. So I work closely with this crew that I won't say is dedicated. I'll have to say that they are vengeful. If I was an invasive in the preserve, I would be a little nervous. I see how much time and effort, relentless effort, that the stewards put into going out to these various areas, sniffing out, hunting down, and finding so many of the invasives that are growing out there, and using some of the apps like Field Maps on the phone. The way this ties back is that the sprayers will be out there. They will put into Field Maps patches or bunches or wherever they saw various invasives that are growing. And when we have contractors come in with that DFFM grant, they don't have to go out there and search. We've got the maps already set up for them. They already know exactly where they need to go and spray. And as you all know, the preserve is not just all flat, simple, easy, open trails. These guys are going out into the roughest terrain that's out there, and they do a phenomenal job. The hundreds and hundreds of hours that they put into that is absolutely remarkable. The city could not do this project alone. The stewards in the Conservancy has been an invaluable force in helping us be as successful as we possibly can with this project. So I hope I summed that up pretty good for everybody. I would like to pass on to Paul very quickly that in one of the previous presentations, they kept, and I'm sorry I walked in partly when it was almost over, but they kept referring it to a party. I wish going after these invasives was more like a party, but I guess if we have to keep our spirits up, we'll call it that from now on. But thank you all very much, and thank all the stewards and Paul and your crew for going out there doing the tremendous amount of work that you guys do.
Okay, thank you, John. We can go on to the next slide. And it is a party out there when we are going after the plants. I'm going to continue the discussion with a little more history of how our management of invasive plants has evolved over the years. And as I go through this, I really hope that two themes continue to be obvious as I discuss it. First, as John has described, this really is a partnership between the city and the Conservancy, both the staff and the stewards. We really could not have accomplished what we have without the cooperation and coordination we have between the two of us, the two groups. And second, going back to all the previous discussion that we've had on our adaptive management strategy approach, I think this is maybe as good an example of how we actually have started to move from the science stage into development of the adaptive management plan to the fact that we actually are already getting a lot of work done and are beginning to learn from what we've accomplished. And we're continuing to adapt that plan as we gain more experience and learn from our results. What I'm going to be talking about primarily is on our two invasive grasses, buffalo grass and fountain grass, because that's where those are the two invasives that are the largest issues and the ones that we've been working on the longest. I'm going to go all the way back in time, really to set the stage for this, all the way back to about 2010, which is when I actually became a Conservancy steward. By coincidence, it also was about the time that Melanie mentioned the Field Institute was established. But I actually first became aware of the concerns about invasive grasses in the preserve through the Conservancy's construction and maintenance program. One of the regular activities of that group at the time, being led by city preserve staff, was to go out and physically dig up the plants and remove them. That work was about as physically demanding as anything we did, since it's not easy to remove a large plant that's buried under a huge rock in the middle of a steep wash in remote territory. But the thing that actually bothered me the most about what we were doing was that I saw that if we didn't return to an area for a couple of years after doing one of these removal projects, all the grass had grown back and you couldn't really tell that anything had ever been done there. So I was interested when I heard that the Conservancy's Field Institute staff was going to start up a group to study the invasive plant issue from a more scientific perspective. The Field Institute was still fairly new at that time, and invasive plants had not previously been a major area of focus. Melanie and Helen were the Field Institute staff back at that time. And as I say, they decided to set up this study group to first review the literature to see what was out there to possibly guide us on what we should be doing. There were a fair number of scientific papers that had been published on buffalo grass, particularly from the University of Arizona in Tucson, since it has started to be recognized as a real concern down there. But many of these were relatively short-term studies that lasted only as long as the money from a grant covered the cost or as a grad student stayed in school. And there was even less on fountain grass, most of which was focused on how it was invading areas in Hawaii, which you have to agree has a somewhat different ecosystem than what we have here in Arizona. So to make a long story short, we decided we would conduct two long-term experiments, one on each of those grasses. I'm not going to cover each of those in detail. Mary summarized them briefly before. We have mentioned several times that we've had papers recently published on both the fountain grass and the buffalo grass studies, but we did learn quite a bit from those. And the one thing that I want to focus on the most, because it has had the most impact on what we've actually been doing, is the strong conclusion that the best technique for getting rid of the grasses is herbicide application rather than physical removal. And I know that herbicide can be a controversial subject, so I'm going to return to some of the study results and how they address this issue. Most importantly, it seems to be more effective in killing the grass and reducing the amount of new growth, particularly for buffalo grass, since it is very difficult to remove all the underground rhizome root system when physically removing it. Herbicide, on the other hand, gets absorbed into the plant's vascular system and should kill the entire plant if applied correctly. The study also determined that herbicide should be more cost effective than plant removal for anything other than very small populations. However, the numbers get a little bit whacked up when the cheap steward labor is factored into it, since you can do a lot of physical labor for not much cost if stewards are willing to do it. But for somebody out in the field doing the work, the thing that I really value is the enhanced efficiency of the effort. The rule of thumb that we've developed through experience and through the studies is that one herbicide applicator can do the work of about 10 people physically out pulling the plants. That's a huge difference when you are faced with the scope of the populations that we are trying to remove. But I also want to address a couple of the concerns that are expressed about herbicide. First, I commonly hear concerns about the ecological impact of using herbicide on the other native plants that may be near the invasive grasses that we are treating. Fortunately, our studies showed that this impact was neutral to maybe even positive as native plants began to return after the invasives were removed. And I know that herbicide exposure can be a personal concern. You hear about some of the lawsuits on the news. But although this is a very personal issue, those of us who are involved with this work are comfortable with the efforts to reduce this risk through appropriate use of personal protective equipment and work practices. This is one where our relationship with the city is really critical. They have been very actively involved with us in providing that PPE that we use and with annual safety training that we all received. So going into the herbicide process in a little more depth, the city requires that all stewards who participate in herbicide application be certified under the Arizona State Department of Agriculture licensing program. This requires passing a test that focuses a lot on personal safety and proper use of the chemicals. 10 stewards are now certified, including 3 recent additions who will be joining the team for the first time for our work in the fall. And as John has mentioned, the city is very supportive of what we are doing, as we legally are all working under the direction of the license that the city has with the state. This slide that you see right now up on the screen kind of summarizes the key results from what we've accomplished over really this is approaching 4 or 5 years now that we've been doing this work. We have treated at least once approximately 500 acres over that time. What we have learned is that we absolutely need to be doing follow-up monitoring and retreatment. It will come back. It'll be a little less every year, but it needs to be done. And so we do as much of that as possible every year, going back to all the acres. Of course, every year that we add new acres, that means more monitoring and retreatment. We've been consistently recognizing over 1,000 steward labor hours per year. And as we look at what we've accomplished, I have used the word in quotes there, under control, in several major areas. The one that you're looking up on the screen, a little hard to see in context, but the map there shows the Browns Mountain area, which is one of the areas where there has been buffalo grass for many, many years. There's a large concentration to the right underneath the trail. That's what you're seeing there. And then a whole bunch of patches out further to the west. This area, in my mind, is under control. I was up there this spring. Did I see some new growth? Yes, but much, much less than what we had seen before. And it really took very little time to try to attack what I saw out there. And as I think was mentioned earlier, the team did receive recognition from the Southwest Vegetation Management Association as Weed Manager of the Year for all the work that we've accomplished. Go on to the next slide. John already introduced the DFFM grant, so I'm not going to have to go into that in too much detail. But what we did recognize, again, working together, the city and the Conservancy, was that although we have accomplished quite a bit with those 500 acres I just mentioned, there is much more work to be done. Unfortunately, one of the things that we've experienced is we continue to find buffalo grass in new areas where we've never seen it before, as it seems to be spreading throughout the preserve. This is something that we have not just experienced here, but I've heard about it elsewhere throughout the valley and in other areas of the state, that buffalo grass is gaining if you don't start to get control over it. So in order to accelerate the efforts that the stewards have put into this, we recognize that it would be great if we could bring in outside contractors to do additional herbicide application, particularly in very large populations in difficult areas. But outside contractors do cost money, which of course requires a source of funds. So we began to talk about how we might be able to apply for grant funds to cover some of the cost. The city actually had some money back in early 2022 from some money that had been provided from APS related to the power line corridor up in the north area of the preserve. At that point in time, in the spring of 2022, we were actually able to bring in some young trainees from the Arizona Conservation Experience who did some work on the buffalo grass on Rounds Mountain, which is one of the main reasons why we've seen so much progress there. But unfortunately, those APS dollars were restricted by agreement to the north area. And most of the grass issues that we have in the preserve are in the McDowells. So as John mentioned, we took advantage of the opportunity to apply for grant funds under an initiative put out by the Arizona Department of Forestry and Fire Management, the DFFM. An interesting thing to note, just as a side note, in this particular application was it was focused on work in the forests in Arizona. There are obviously areas of Arizona that are more truly forested than what we have, but fortunately DFM counted saguaros as forests because we have such large populations of those. And it obviously is a concern because we know that fires have done significant damage over the years to the saguaro populations. So just a couple more details on that grant process. The city, if we haven't made it clear, I think everybody knows, is the landowner and the manager of the preserve. So they were technically the applicant for the grant funds. But this truly was a joint effort where city staff and conservancy staff and stewards worked together in preparing the application. A critical part of the preparation was our first comprehensive strategic plan that covered how we would continue to attack the invasive grass issue. And as the map on the left shows, we specifically identified 4 project areas as the spots where we would focus the initial contractor work if we were successful in receiving the grant funds. And as John mentioned, the application required the demonstration of matching funds to supplement the money that would be provided by the state, which was relatively easy to do, given all the contributions of the Conservancy, particularly from the stewards. The result was that DFM was very impressed by what we had already accomplished and what our future plans envisioned. And as mentioned, we successfully received a grant close to the maximum amount available under the program. Using these funds, the city contracted with a company called EnviroSystems out of Flagstaff. Again, both Conservancy and city were very involved in developing the planning process for what they should be doing. One additional activity was a couple of helicopter water drops that were done to deliver water to the areas where the work would be done, since getting the water necessary to mix with the herbicide concentrate is one of the biggest challenges of this type of effort. The city's contract with the helicopter pilot was also paid for through the DFFM grant. So as of right now, EnviroSystems has completed approximately 2/3 of the planned work covered by the grant. They did this through working 3 sessions of approximately 5 to 10 days each and sprayed over 300 acres. Based on the overall results of that and the fact that we're always looking for more help from a financial perspective, we certainly plan to work together to go after additional grant opportunities in the future. We can go to the last slide. Very, very briefly, just go over a couple other aspects of our activity. Our regional partnerships with other land managers and conservation organizations in the area is critical to our success. One item I didn't mention previously, I think John mentioned it very briefly, is the active role that we played in developing a phone app that may be easily used by stewards and others to survey and map the location of invasives so we know where the work needs to be done. One of our regional partners has been actively involved with us in development and continued refinement of this product. And it's now been shared with many others throughout the valley. Our regional group called Desert Defenders meets regularly to share best practices so we can all learn from each other's experiences, as well as to jointly develop materials, educational materials that can be used to educate governmental leaders and the general public about the threat of invasives and what can be done about them. A specific area of focus right now that I haven't really covered, we did mention it earlier, is the rapid spread of stinknet, which is a very invasive annual flowering plant. It does pose a real threat to desert ecology and can become a major fire hazard. But the best techniques for removing it are much less developed than for the grasses. So we're all working together to try to figure out how best to try to control it. I mentioned public education. We're expanding our efforts to work with HOAs, businesses, others that are located near the preserve, since of course the invasives do not recognize and respect the boundaries that have arbitrarily been established between the undeveloped area of the preserve and the developed areas that surround us. So that's all I have. Don't know, Lars, if we have any time for questions, but we're available either through chat or otherwise if necessary.
No, thank you, Paul. And thank you, Melanie, John, Paul. We all appreciate your hard work and leadership in this area. Due to time, I think we'll try to answer any remaining questions through chat. I do see some compliments on the hard work there. So yeah, we'll attempt to answer them via chat. And I guess at this point, back to you, Melanie.